Lindsay. God, what the hell happened? Someone. Oh my God, call 911 for an ambulance. She's not breathing in Beckham. Beckham's fainted. The words shot through the nursery like a bullet. Finley Walters, still in his tailored navy suit from the board meeting he'd left early, stood frozen for a split second before sprinting across the polished oak floor. A half-used bottle of baby formula rolled beneath the crib, and on the floor, Lindsay Foster, his housemaid, lay sprawled, fainted, her arm curled protectively around his son, 3-year-old Beckham, who whimpered weakly, drenched in sweat. But what Finley didn't know was this. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach, and make sure you're subscribed up Storytelling so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now, let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. Only minutes earlier, Beckham had suffered a violent febrile seizure. Lindsay had heard the strange, choking cry while scrubbing the laundry sink downstairs. She dropped the towel in her hand and raced up the forbidden stairs without thinking. In the nursery, she'd found Beckham convulsing, tiny limbs stiff, his eyes fluttering and unfocused, his skin burned to the touch. "Sweetheart, stay with me," she had whispered, grabbing the damp cloth from the shelf, cradling his burning body against hers. Her hands shook as she cooled his forehead, stroked his cheeks, whispered his name over and over like a prayer. The nannies were gone. No one answered her calls. And then something cold, a sharp sting at the back of her neck, a scent chemical, bitter, artificial. She'd barely turned her head before everything blurred. Her limbs went limp, her chest tightened. The nursery lights spun above her like carousel bulbs. As darkness swallowed her, the last thing she heard was Beckham's tiny cry against her collarbone. Now, as Finley knelt beside them, he didn't see any of that. Beckham, no. Breathe, son. Stay with me. Finley's voice cracked. He turned to Lindsay, his chest heaving. She didn't move. A beat later, Sophie Perry, the housekeeper, ran into the room, feigning panic, hand over her chest. "Oh, my Lord," she gasped. "Mr. Walters, I was just downstairs getting fresh diapers. I came back and found them like this. She must have done something. That bottle, it's open. And there's medicine on the floor." Finley's eyes darted to the nursery table. A small bottle lay uncapped. Its contents spilled across the floor. His heart pounded faster. But something wasn't right. Beckham's cries slowed. His limbs trembled. Finley held him tighter, shouting over his shoulder, "Oh my God, call 911 for an ambulance!" Now. As Sophie disappeared, Finley shifted Lindsay slightly, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint, sluggish. Her skin was clammy. Her breathing was shallow. What the hell happened? He looked around again. Beckham had clearly been sick. A small bowl of water sat beside the crib, along with a towel soaked in lukewarm water. There was even a thermometer on the floor, still blinking. Lindsay had been cooling him down. But then, how had she passed out? Finley didn't notice the faint scent of something sharp lingering in the air, like alcohol mixed with citrus. He didn't see the faint red mark on Lindsay's wrist where a small injection had bruised the skin too clean to be accidental. What he saw was a terrifying scene. His son nearly seized, and the maid fainted on the nursery floor with no explanation. The paramedics arrived swiftly, one crouched by Beckham, another by Lindsay. "Baby's running a dangerously high fever," one EMT murmured. "We need to stabilize his temperature. It could have led to a seizure." Finley's fists clenched. He looked back at Lindsay as the other medic checked her vitals. "Severe dehydration," the medic said. "Possibly drugged, maybe passed out from exhaustion or low blood sugar. But we'll need tests." "Drugged?" Finley echoed sharply. "She smells like sedatives," the EMT added quietly. "Could be accidental. Could be administered. We won't know until the talk screen comes back." That was the moment it snapped. Finley stood, fists clenched at his sides. His jaw tightened as he turned toward Lindsay's faint figure, fury boiling inside him. "She drugged herself in my son's room." His voice cracked, but no one answered. When Lindsay stirred minutes later, barely able to open her eyes, her head spun. Her body was heavy. She tried to speak, but the words died on her lips. Finley stepped forward, his shadow falling over her like a curtain. "What did you do to him?" he shouted, his voice laced with fury and panic. Lindsay blinked, struggling to sit up. He had a fever. He started shaking. "Don't lie to me!" Finley roared. "Don't you dare. You had no business being in here. You touched my son. You poisoned him, and now you're going to play the victim." "I didn't. I swear I was trying to help." "Shut up." He moved so suddenly she flinched. In his rage, his hand jerked forward. Not a slap, not a punch, but as he reached to yank her up by the arm, his grip was too hard. Her head knocked sharply against the wooden bedpost behind her with a thud. She gasped in pain. "Don't pretend to care," he growled. "I should have listened when they said to keep you away." The medics pulled him back. "Sir, please. She still fainted. She needs medical attention." When Lindsay closed her eyes, pain radiating from the side of her head. But what hurt more was his voice. She had admired him from afar. This grieving father. This broken man is trying to raise his son alone, and now he stood over her, treating her like nothing. Sophie reappeared, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "I warned you about her," she whispered to Finley. "People like her, they pretend. Always looking for sympathy. You saw the bottle. The ambulance lights flashed red and blue outside." Lindsay was lifted onto a stretcher, her limp hand brushing against Beckham's blanket. The boy cried softly. Lindsay turned her face toward the sound, eyes wet. "I didn't hurt him," she whispered. Finley didn't respond. At the hospital, Lindsay was placed in a separate ward under observation. Beckham was stabilized, fever brought down with fluids and medication. Hours later, the pediatrician met Finley in the hallway. "Your son's going to be okay," she said softly. "But I have to ask who's been caring for him lately." Finley blinked. "The nanny, Sophie, oversees it." The doctor hesitated. "He shows signs of emotional withdrawal. No bonding, little response to stimuli. That doesn't happen overnight." Finley said nothing. He was still thinking of the way Beckham had clung to Lindsay's shirt, even fainted. The next morning, Lindsay woke to find herself alone in the sterile hospital room. Her wrist was bruised, her head still pounding. She turned slowly, eyes burning. No one came. No one believed her. In the silence, a single word fell from her lips like a prayer torn from the heart. "Beckham, if you felt Lindsay's pain, hit like and comment where you're watching from. You might find someone near you feeling the same." She turned her head slowly, wincing at the soreness in her neck. A thin bandage wrapped around her temple where she'd hit the bedpost the night before. Her wrist was bruised, her pride shattered. She reached for the call button, not because she needed help, but just to prove she could still move her hand. The nurse entered a minute later, a middle-aged woman with a kind but tired face. "You're awake," she said gently, checking the 4. "How are you feeling?" Lindsay hesitated. "I'm still trying to figure out if this is real." The nurse gave her a sympathetic glance. "You passed out from exhaustion." "That and well, whatever someone injected you with." Lindsay blinked. "Injected?" The nurse nodded. "Small puncture in your wrist. Trace amounts of a sedative were found in your system. Nothing over the counter." Lindsay's heart dropped. Someone had drugged her. That meant this wasn't just an accident. Someone wanted her out of that room. "Do you know who?" Lindsay whispered. The nurse looked hesitant. "They didn't say, but the police weren't called. Mr. Walters's private team handled everything." "Of course they did." Lindsay bit the inside of her cheek, keeping the tears back. "Your clothes were sent back to your agency," the nurse added, "and someone from the Walters estate dropped off your final check. It's already processed." "Already?" Lindsay asked, startled. The nurse paused. "I think they want this to be over." The words landed hard, like a verdict. Later that morning, Lindsay was discharged with little ceremony. No one from the Walters household came. No driver, no explanation, just silence. She walked out of the hospital in the same clothes she'd worn 2 nights before, now wrinkled and still faintly smelling of baby powder and antiseptic. The taxi she flagged down took her back to her tiny studio apartment on the edge of Queens. The heater groaned when she stepped inside, and the single-pane windows rattled in the wind. Her mother, Michelle, was sitting in the kitchen knitting a faded scarf with fingers that trembled slightly. Her eyes lit up when she saw Lindsay, but that smile faltered as she took in her daughter's injuries. "Oh, baby," she whispered. "What did they do to you?" Lindsay didn't answer. She sank into the chair across from her mother and let her bag slide to the floor. The check they gave her was still folded in the back pocket of her jeans. Blood money. She stared at the wall where a faded photo of her younger brother Marcus still hung. He'd been in the Navy before the accident. The hospital bills were why she had taken the job in the first place. Working for one of the richest men in the Northeast was supposed to mean security. But in that house, even compassion was a risk. I tried to help his son. Lindsay finally said he had a fever. He was shaking. No one was there. Michelle reached across the table, placing a hand over Lindsay's bruised fingers. Sometimes the right thing costs more than we expect. Doesn't mean it wasn't worth doing. That night, Lindsay lay awake on her creaky mattress, listening to the city bars outside, honking horns, distant voices. Her mind kept drifting back to Beckham, his red cheeks. The way his tiny hand had gripped her shirt, even while he was fainted, he had looked for her. I chose her. She closed her eyes and whispered his name again. Beckham. Across town, in a mansion too large for one man and a baby, Finley Walters sat at his desk, unable to focus on the investment reports blinking on his screen. Beckham was finally asleep upstairs, but only after 2 nurses tried for hours to calm him. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't spoken. He just lay there, silent, staring at the ceiling. Finley pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to push away the image that haunted him. Beckham, cradled in Lindsay's arms, flushed with fever, but calmer than he'd ever been with any of the staff. "You didn't belong there," he muttered to the empty room, but the words rang hollow. A knock came at his door. Sophie entered. Her expression was composed. "The staff has been rebriefed," she said, "and the agency confirmed Lindsay won't be returning to the roster. They're investigating her." Finley looked up. "Investigating? She may have falsified medical experience," Sophie said, folding her hands. "She was seen in the nursery multiple times without authorization." Finley's lips pressed into a line. He should have felt justified, but instead, a strange guilt gnawed at his chest. "Mr. Harrington," Sophie continued, "you need stability structure." She wasn't part of that. He dismissed her with a nod. After she left, he sat back in his chair, rubbing his temple. Structure. That's all. His house had become stone walls in silence. Since Lydia's death, the mansion had become a mausoleum. And now, the only person who had ever sung in its halls, however briefly, was gone. Back in Queens, Lindsay sat by the window, watching a light drizzle coat the glass. She sipped weak tea, her fingers curled around the warm mug. Her mother had gone to sleep hours ago, the scarf still half-finished in her lap. In the dim reflection, Lindsay saw her own face, tired, bruised, but not broken. She whispered softly to no one in particular. "I didn't hurt him. I saved him." Her voice was barely louder than the rain, but steady. The world could believe what it wanted, but she knew the truth. She just didn't know what to do with it yet. The following morning, Beckham sat curled in a ball on the oversized rocking chair near the window, wrapped in a soft blue blanket. The nurse tried coaxing him with a rattle, then with a spoonful of applesauce, then with the usual singing voice that had worked with so many other children. Nothing. His face was expressionless. His eyes didn't track the motion of the toy, nor did he react to the gentle strokes of her hand across his hair. He wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming. He was simply distant. Finley stood just outside the room, watching from the doorway, his arms crossed, his knuckles white against the fabric of his suit. The therapist Dr. Julia Davis, a child development specialist from Columbia, arrived at precisely 9 a.m. She was in her early 52nds, a calm presence with silver-threaded hair tied into a low bun and eyes that read a room before anyone spoke a word. She didn't approach Beckham immediately. She crouched on the floor several feet away and waited, folding her hands in her lap. "He hasn't spoken since the fever broke," the nurse whispered to her. No appetite, no vocalizations, not even eye contact. Dr. Davis gave a single nod and quietly gestured for everyone else to step out. Finley hesitated. "I'd prefer to observe," he said. "With respect, Mr. Walters," she replied, gently but firmly. Sometimes a parent's presence reinforces silence. Her words cut deeper than he expected. He stepped back. Downstairs, the grand foyer sat empty, except for the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock. Finley wandered into the kitchen where Sophie was arranging a tray of freshly cut fruit and pastries. "He's not responding," he said, voice low. "They said he's emotionally detached." Sophie set a cup of tea beside him. "It'll pass. He's sensitive, that's all. He just needs time. Routine, familiarity." Finley stared into the cup. "He wasn't like this before." Sophie offered a thin smile. "Children his age go through phases, you'll see." But her voice lacked conviction. Finley didn't drink the tea. Upstairs, Dr. Davis spoke in soft tones. She didn't push Beckham, didn't make demands. Instead, she sat beside him with a toy piano on the rug, gently tapping out the notes, too. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. She watched his eyes flicker just slightly. But that flicker gave her something Sophie hadn't told. When she stepped out of the nursery an hour later, she found Finley pacing the hall. "He's not unreachable," she began, "but he's emotionally fractured, not just from the fever. This has been happening for a while." Finley rubbed his neck, tension crawling up his shoulders. "He lost his mother at birth." "I know," Dr. Davis said softly. "But grief isn't the only thing that isolates a child. Beckham doesn't seem to associate safety with anyone around him." Finley looked away. Dr. Davis continued. "He did respond slightly to a song. His eyes moved briefly when I played it." Finley frowned. "What song?" She smiled faintly. "An old lullaby. One I heard a nurse humming on the baby monitor footage just before your son's fever episode." Finley's eyes darkened. He knew what footage she was talking about. The baby monitor had been recording. Sophie had said the footage was lost during a system reset. Dr. Davis handed him a small USB drive. "I took the liberty of requesting a copy from your network backup. I thought you might want to watch." She didn't wait for a response. She simply patted his arm and left. Finley stared at the small device in his hand for a long moment. Then he walked back into his study, shut the door, and plugged it into his computer. The footage wasn't sharp, but it didn't need to be. There was Beckham, curled in his crib, whimpering softly. And there was Lindsay entering the room quietly, not sneaking, not nervous, just gentle, intentional. She picked up the child, cradled him close, and began humming her voice faint but warm. She cooled his forehead, whispered reassurances, and held him until his cries softened. Then something Finley hadn't noticed the first time movement behind her. A figure, Sophie. She stood in the hallway for a moment, watching, then disappeared. Seconds later, Lindsay's body jerked. Her hands trembled. She stumbled slightly and leaned against the crib. Then she collapsed to the floor, still clutching Beckham tightly to her chest. Finley hit pause. The room spun. For a moment he couldn't breathe. He remembered the bruises on Lindsay's wrist, the nurse mentioning an injection site, the scent of something sharp in the nursery, the EMT whispering, possibly drug. And all at once, the pieces slid into place. "Oh my God," Finley whispered. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood. He walked to the fireplace and pressed a hand against the mantel, trying to steady himself. He had hurt her, not just physically. He had humiliated her, called her a liar, accused her of harming his son, and all she'd done was protect Beckham, comfort him, save him. Downstairs, Sophie passed by the doorway with a stack of clean towels. She paused when she saw him. "Is something wrong?" she asked smoothly. Finley turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "No," he said, "not yet." For night, he couldn't sleep. He sat beside Beckham's crib in the dark, watching his son breathe. The little boy clutched the edge of his blanket, twitching slightly in his dreams. Finley reached over and gently placed a hand on his back. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." And for the first time in weeks, Beckham stirred and made a small sound, a soft sigh, like the end of a held breath. It was the sound of a child still waiting to be held. The following day dawned cold and grey, rain smearing the windows of Lindsay's tiny apartment like watercolor tears. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a warm mug of chamomile tea between her palms, the steam rising gently toward her bruised face. Her mother, Michelle, was still asleep in the adjoining room. "Her cough is faint but persistent," Lindsay hadn't told her about everything that happened. Not the way Finley Walters had shouted at her. Not the sharp knock of her skull against the wooden crib post. Not the way it felt to be carried out like trash. No questions asked. No truth heard. She had tried to be strong for Michelle, but now, sitting in silence, her strength felt thin as the threadbare quilt wrapped around her shoulders. Her phone buzzed quietly on the nightstand. She picked it up. Unknown number. She stared at it for a moment. Her fingers hovered, heart unsure, but curiosity overruled her pain. "Hello?" she said, her voice still a pause. Then a low, cautious voice replied. "Miss Foster, this is Dr. Julia Davis. I'm a child therapist currently working with Beckham Walters." Lindsay's breath caught. "Is he okay?" "He's stable, but he's not responding, withdrawn, or emotionally shut down." Lindsay closed her eyes, the memory of Beckham's small, fevered body in her arms pressing hard on her chest. "I know you've been through something traumatic, Doctor," Davis continued, "and I wasn't sure if calling you was appropriate, but I reviewed some footage. I know what happened." Lindsay sat straighter. "What do you mean?" "I saw you care for Beckham. I saw Sophie Perry standing outside the room before you collapsed." Silence. "I believe someone drugged you, Lindsay, Doctor," Davis said softly. "And I believe Mr. Walters does too now." The words hit harder than Lindsay expected. Finley knew after all that venom, all that mistrust. He knew. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because the truth needs a voice. And because Beckham hasn't smiled since you left." The call ended shortly after, but Lindsay didn't move for a long time. Her tea had gone cold in her hands. She sat motionless, staring at the dripping window pane. Outside, the city moved on buses grumbling past. Neighbors calling to each other. The smell of rain on warm concrete. But inside her, something had shifted. Not hope. Not yet, but something close to it. Across town, Finley stood in the nursery doorway, watching Beckham play listlessly with a stuffed elephant. The boy's shoulders slumped as he nudged the toy without focus. No sound, no smile. The grief inside Finley was sharper now. Not just the old pain of losing Lydia, but the new ache of betrayal. Not by Lindsay, but by himself. He had let his fear blind him. Again, he turned away from the nursery and headed downstairs. He found Sophie in the parlor, folding linens at the side table. "Can I speak to you?" he asked, voice calm but brittle. "Of course," she said sweetly. "Is everything all right?" "I reviewed the security footage," he said plainly. Her hands stopped moving. "I saw you outside the nursery," he continued. "I saw you leave and then Lindsay collapses. A few minutes after you re-enter the house with no explanation, Gilda's face didn't change. Coincidence, she said. She was clearly unstable. You saw how she behaved. I also saw Beckham reach for her. I saw her lower his fever. I saw kindness. What I didn't see was a threat." Sophie's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're trusting a maid over someone who served your family for years." "I'm trusting the truth," Finley replied coldly. She dropped the linen onto the chair beside her. "You don't know what she's capable of." "No," he said, stepping closer. "But I know what you are. You're fired, Sophie. Effective immediately. I've sent the footage to my lawyers and to the police." She laughed. "But it was hollow. You'll regret this. She'll ruin you." "She already saved my son." With that he turned and left her standing in the stillness of the parlor, surrounded by folded towels and silence. The door slammed shut behind him. Later that afternoon, Lindsay opened her apartment door to find a courier standing there with an envelope in hand. She signed for it, puzzled, then closed the door and carefully opened the seal. Inside, a letter typed formal, but the last paragraph made her hand tremble. "I was wrong, deeply, unforgivably wrong, and I know it's not enough, but I'm asking not as your former employer, but as a father, if you'll consider returning. Not as help, but as Beckham's caregiver, with full rights, full protection, and my complete trust. Signed, Finley Walters." Below the letter was a business card and a handwritten note. "He misses you. We both do." Lindsay stared at the page for a long time. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Part of her wanted to tear it in half. Another part wanted to run, but a quiet, stubborn part, The part that had wrapped a trembling baby in her arms and hummed lullabies through exhaustion, held the letter close and whispered, "This isn't over." That night Beckham stirred in his crib. Finley sat beside him, as he often did now, watching the rise and fall of his chest. But something was different. The little boy reached toward the air, as if grasping for something that wasn't there. Then he whispered, barely audible, "Lindsay." Finley's breath caught, and in a neighborhood apartment far from marble floors and silk curtains, Lindsay felt something stir inside her too. The next morning brought rain again, gentler this time, steady and whispering like a lullaby across the rooftops of Queens. Lindsay stood in front of the cracked mirror above her sink, smoothing the front of her blouse with shaking hands. She hadn't worn this shirt in weeks. It still smelled faintly of baby powder and lemon cleaner. The letter from Finley Walters lay folded neatly on the nightstand. She'd read it 6 times the night before, not out of disbelief, but out of fear that it might disappear if she blinked too long. Behind her, her mother's voice echoed faintly from the other room. "You're going, aren't you?" Lindsay turned slightly. "I haven't decided." Michelle stepped into the small kitchen space, pulling her robe tighter around her frail frame. "Yes, you have. You wouldn't be wearing your Sunday blouse if you hadn't." Lindsay let out a quiet breath. What if he's just trying to clear his conscience? What if he doesn't really mean it? "Then go for the child," Michelle said. "Not for him." Lindsay looked down, tears stinging her eyes. "Beckham called my name," she whispered. "Doctor," Davis said. He reached for me. "I don't know how that's even possible because babies know who holds them when they're scared," Michelle said gently. "And they never forget who shows up when nobody else does." Later that afternoon, Lindsay stood at the edge of the Walters estate's long driveway, her umbrella trembling in the wind. The row iron gates loomed tall ahead of her, slick with rain and memory. Her shoes, once polished, were now scuffed from the subway and the wet sidewalks. She clutched her worn leather purse tighter to her side and pressed the intercom button. A familiar voice answered. "This is Walter's residence." "It's Lindsay Foster," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I, Mr. Walters, sent me a letter." There was a pause. Then the gates opened slowly with a groan, as if the house itself was uncertain whether to welcome her back. Lindsay walked the long stone path lined with soaked rose bushes and trimmed hedges, every step echoing with the ghost of her last visit, the shouting, the fear, the crash of her body hitting the floor. But this time, when the front door opened, it wasn't a servant or an assistant standing there. It was Finley. He stood in a grey sweater and slacks, no suit, no tie. His sleeves rolled up, his face looked thinner, his eyes tired but clear. "Lindsay," he said softly. She nodded. "You asked me to come." "I did," he replied. "I wasn't sure if you would." Lindsay stepped inside slowly, her heels tapping gently on the marble floor. The house was still the same, clean, grand, cold, but something felt different, not warmer. "Exactly. Just Kedar waiting." "I cleared the staff for the afternoon," Finley said, closing the door behind her. "Just you, me, and Beckham." Lindsay turned to face him fully. "Why now?" Finley's jaw clenched. "Because I saw everything. What you did for my son, what she did to you, Sophie," Lindsay said. He nodded. "She's gone. Fired. And I've opened a police investigation." Lindsay crossed her arms. "And what about me? You accuse me of poisoning your son. You grabbed me. You didn't even let me speak." His eyes dropped. "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me for that. But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least give you the chance to speak now." Lindsay was silent for a moment. Then she said quietly, "He had a fever. His body was shaking. No one came. I wiped him down, held him, sang to him, and then everything went black." "I know," Finley said, voice rough. "She drugged you. We found traces in the towel she planted. She wanted you gone. Maybe because she saw what I didn't, that mattered to Beckham in a way no one else did." Lindsay's lips trembled slightly, but she didn't cry. "Where is he?" she asked. Finley gestured toward the nursery upstairs. "He's been quiet again. We've tried, but he barely responds to anyone. Not since you left." Lindsay hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. Then, without another word, she headed for the stairs. Each step echoed like a heartbeat in the still house. At the top, she paused outside the nursery door. Her hand hovered above the knob. Then, she heard a faint, broken whimper. She pushed the door open. Beckham sat curled in the corner of his crib, his face turned toward the window. His stuffed elephant lay beside him untouched. The moment Lindsay stepped into the room, his head turned. His eyes met hers. For a beat, nothing happened. Then, like a single thread pulling loose from a tapestry, he reached out. Lindsay won. Her hand flew to her mouth. A sound escaped her throat, part gasp, part sob. She rushed to the crib, kneeling beside it, hands trembling as she touched his fingers. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm here now." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers, his tiny hand resting on her cheek. Downstairs, Finley watched the baby monitor screen in stunned silence. For the first time in days, Beckham smiled. Just a little, but enough. Later that evening, Lindsay sat in the rocking chair with Beckham curled against her chest, asleep, breathing steady. Finley entered quietly, standing at the doorway. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Lindsay looked up at him. "I'm not coming back as help," she said softly. "Not without boundaries. Not without respect." Finley nodded. "You're not helping. You're home." The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the Walters estate bathed in a strange hush, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Sunlight filtered through the nursery curtains in soft golden stripes, casting a glow over Beckham's crib and the quiet silhouette of Lindsay as she gently rocked him in her arms. He had fallen asleep again sometime around dawn, one tiny hand tangled in the collar of her blouse, his head tucked against the familiar curve of her shoulder. Lindsay had barely moved for hours, afraid that even the slightest shift might wake him, or worse, break the delicate peace she had only just restored. Finley stood at the threshold of the room, watching from a respectful distance. "I can bring you coffee," he said, voice low. Lindsay looked up slowly, tired but calm. "Not yet," he nodded and stepped back, retreating silently like a man aware that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be earned in inches, not leaps. Later, after Beckham had been tucked back into bed and the household began to stir, Ma sat at the long oak dining table downstairs, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. The room, like the rest of the mansion, was immaculate white stone counters, stainless steel fixtures, not a dish out of place, but beneath the shine, Lindsay could feel the weight of emptiness, the kind that no money could clean. Finley joined her, placing a folder on the table. His sleeves were rolled up again, and a faint shadow lined his jaw, signs of a man finally too distracted to shave. "I drew up a contract," he said. "Full rights. You'll be Beckham's primary caregiver. Salary doubled. Medical, dental, private transportation if needed. I also included a clause that protects your decisions regarding his emotional well-being." Lindsay opened the folder slowly. The legal language was dense but clear. Boundaries, security, a measure of trust on paper, even if the one between them in person was still fragile. "No live-in requirement," she murmured. "I appreciate that." Finley nodded. "You'll have access to your own schedule. No contact with household staff unless you choose to coordinate. And if anything makes you feel unsafe, you walk." "No explanation needed." Lindsay closed the folder and set it gently aside. "Why are you going to all this trouble?" she asked, not unkindly. "Is this guilt talking, or is this about Beckham?" Finley exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Both." Lindsay waited. "I don't know how to get what Beckham needs," he said finally, "and I don't know how to fix what I broke with you. But I know what I saw. He smiled when he saw you. The first real smile I've seen since he was born." Lindsay looked down at her mug. "I'm not his mother," she said. "No," Finley agreed. "But you're someone who shows up, and that matters more than you know." A beat of silence passed. Outside, a robin landed on the windowsill, chirping into the quiet. "I'll take the position," Lindsay said, her voice steady. "But I have conditions too," Finley raised an eyebrow. "Let's hear them. First, I don't want to be called for help or treated like that. I'm here for Beckham, not to serve your dinner or iron your shirts." "Understood." "Second," she continued, "I want full access to the baby monitor footage moving forward. No blind spots, No erasing tapes. Oh, you'll have it. And third, she said, her tone softening just slightly, you owe me an apology. A real one. Not for paperwork. For me. Finley leaned back in his chair, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't flinch. I'm sorry, Lindsay. I failed you. I let fear blind me, and I let someone I trusted hurt you. I doubted your heart, and that's not something I can undo. But I promise you this, I'll never doubt it again. Lindsay didn't smile, but she nodded. That's a start. That afternoon, Beckham took his first nap in days without needing sedation. Lindsay lay beside him on a soft mat, humming the same lullaby she had once whispered in the dark, her voice barely audible over the quiet tick of the wall clock. Finley watched from the hallway unseen. He could hear her singing, "Sleep, little one. The night is here." The melody stirred something in him, something old and fragile. He thought of Lydia then, the way she used to hum while reading, the faint scent of her shampoo in the morning. She had died bringing Beckham into the world. And since that day, Finley had tried to hold everything together through silence and order. But maybe silence wasn't the answer. Maybe love didn't live in rules and routines, but in lullabies and borrowed strength. That evening, Finley knocked gently on Lindsay's door, the guest suite they'd set up for her. Now she opened it, surprised to see him standing there with 2 mugs of tea. "Chamomal," he said, holding one out to her. "I remember you liked it." Lindsay took it slowly. "Thank you." They sat by the window in silence for a while, watching the clouds roll past the moon. "I'm not good at this," Finley admitted. "The emotions, the parenting, the humility. You don't have to be good at it," Lindsay replied. "You just have to be honest about where you are." He looked at her, then really looked, not as a maid, not as an employee, but as a woman who had stood between his son and harm, even while being harmed herself. "I'm trying," he said. Lindsay nodded. "So am I." In the nursery, Beckham slept peacefully, one tiny hand curled around the ear of his stuffed elephant, and somewhere between guilt and healing, silence and song, something new began to bloom. Sunday morning crept in gently, wrapping the Walters estate in warm light and still air. The rain had cleared, leaving the stone driveway slick with sunlight. Birds chirped in the hedges, and the scent of blooming gardenias drifted in through open windows. Down in the kitchen, Lindsay was flipping waffles on the cast-iron griddle. She wore an apron too large for her, tied twice at the back, and her curls were tucked under a soft head wrap. Beckham sat in a booster seat beside the counter, banging a plastic spoon on the tray while babbling something only Lindsay seemed to understand. She smiled, turning to wipe a dab of syrup from his chin. "That's a big opinion for someone with no teeth, mister." Beckham giggled, a small, round giggle that caught Finley by surprise as he stood in the doorway. He hadn't heard his son laugh like that since before the fever. Since before everything fell apart, he took a slow step into the room. Lindsay noticed him and gestured to the plate already set on the island bar. "Waffles," she said. "No silver spoon required." "No." He walked over, glancing at the golden stack. "Didn't know you cooked." "You didn't ask," she replied, then looked back at Beckham. "Besides, someone needs to make sure this kid eats real food." Finley sat on the stool, trying to suppress a smile. "You are always this bossy before breakfast, only with billionaires and babies." They shared a look, still cautious, but with the faintest trace of something warmer. Beckham reached out to Lindsay again, and she lifted him into her lap, letting him rest his head against her shoulder as she continued eating with one hand. "You make it look easy," Finley said softly. "It's not," she replied. "It's just love." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Later that day, while Beckham napped, Lindsay wandered through the west wing of the estate. She hadn't had much time to explore when she was still the help, but now she walked with a little more ownership in her step. She passed family portraits of Finley as a child in a blazer too big for him, a stiff-looking man in uniform, his father, maybe. And finally, a framed photo of Finley and a woman in a flowing sundress, her eyes almond-shaped and bright, arms wrapped around her swollen belly. Lydia Lindsay studied the picture for a long time, her hand resting lightly on the wall beneath it. The woman's smile was open, joyful. She looked nothing like the mansion around her. She looked like sunlight. She hated this house. Finley's voice came quietly from behind. Lindsay turned. She said it was too quiet. he continued, stepping up beside her. Too cold. But I insisted. Said it was secure, safe, logical. She looks happy in the photo. Lindsay offered gently. She smiled at me, Finlay replied, even when she was scared, even when the doctors said she wouldn't make it through childbirth. Lindsay's eyes lowered. You stayed in this house after she passed? She asked. I didn't know how to leave, Finlay admitted. Beckham was all I had left, and I thought if I controlled everything, his food, his toys, his world, then I could keep him safe. But control isn't safety, Lindsay said. It's a cage. He looked at her, surprised by the clarity of her words. But she wasn't done. You can't parent from fear, Finlay. I know fear. I've lived with it. It eats you from the inside. But kids, especially kids like Beckham, need trust more than perfection. They need presence. A messy, uncertain presence. Finlay didn't speak, but he nodded. That evening, Lindsay sat with Beckham on the rug in the living room. They stacked wooden blocks one by one until the tower swayed dangerously high. Then Beckham, grinning, knocked them over with a triumphant squeal. Chaos, huh? Lindsay said, tussling his hair. You're your father's son, after all. Finlay watched from the couch, half a glass of wine in his hand, his eyes soft. He hadn't seen Beckham this engaged in ever. When the clock struck 7, Ma stood. I should get going. Wait, Finlay said quickly. Do you have to? She turned to him. I mean, he stammered, you're not on duty, but I was hoping you'd stay for dinner. Not for Beckham. For me. Lindsay tilted her head. Are you asking me out, Mr. Walters? He raised an eyebrow. I'm asking if you'd like grilled salmon, roasted potatoes, and the worst bottle of wine in my collection. She pretended to consider. The wine sounds terrible. It is, she smirked. All right, but only if Beckham gets dessert first. Deal. They moved to the dining room, a space Lindsay had never entered before. It was massive, filled with expensive art and untouched china. But tonight, it felt different. Finlay had set the table himself, one candle flickering in the center. Beckham's plastic plate sitting proudly next to the fine silver. Halfway through the meal, Lindsay glanced toward the baby monitor clipped to her belt. Beckham was asleep, peaceful again. Finlay reached for his wineglass, swirling it without sipping. Do you think he'll remember any of this? Lindsay looked at him. He won't remember the fear. Kids don't hold on to pain the same way we do. But he'll remember love, warmth, and who came back when no one else did. Finlay exhaled. You came back. Lindsay's voice was soft but steady. I didn't come back for you. He smiled faintly. I know, but I'm grateful all the same. In the silence that followed, the clink of cutlery and the hum of quiet jazz on the radio went together into something almost holy. A billionaire, a black woman once falsely accused, and a little boy who smiled in his sleep for the first time in weeks. They weren't a family, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, they were becoming one. The following week settled into something resembling rhythm, not routine. Finlay had learned the hard way that nothing about parenting followed a perfect schedule, but there was a gentler flow now. Mornings began with Lindsay's calm voice and Beckham's small footsteps pattering down the hallway. Breakfast no longer echoed with silence, but with the clatter of spoons, the soft rustle of newspapers, and the occasional fit of giggles from the high chair. Finlay often found himself lingering near the kitchen just to listen, but with peace came questions, and Finlay had many. One afternoon, while Beckham napped and Lindsay read beside the nursery window, Finlay walked into the study with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in weeks. He opened his laptop, navigated to the encrypted files recovered from his home's security system, and reviewed the footage again. There, Sophie, standing outside Beckham's room. She had paused for exactly 38 seconds. Her hand moved inside her apron. When she stepped away, Lindsay stumbled, then collapsed. He paused the frame and leaned in, the glint of a syringe. Finlay leaned back, jaw clenched. The case was already under police review, but the wheels of justice turned slowly, and something inside him, it wasn't satisfied with just reporting. He needed to understand why. Why would Sophie, the woman who'd served his family since he was a teenager, do this? So, he went digging. The Walters Foundation's HR archives were buried under layers of digital bureaucracy, but Finlay still held admin access. He found Sophie's old personnel files, scanned emails, and a curious flag from the previous year. Concern raised by employees regarding caregiver hostility. The report had been closed, no investigation, no names. He pulled up another file, notes from an old household employee dismissed 6 months before Lindsay was hired. Termination reason: unfit temperament, unwilling to follow chain of command. Finley frowned. He searched the name Stephanie Gregory and found an old address in East Harlem. That evening, after Lindsay left and Beckham had gone to bed, Finley made the drive. The neighborhood was tight and aging, filled with brownstones and corner bodiers. A woman in her early 52s answered the door, wearing a stained hoodie and the kind of guarded look that came from years of being overlooked. "Stephanie Gregory?" Finley asked. She blinked, surprised. "You the cop?" He shook his head. "I'm Finley Walters." Her eyes narrowed. "The billionaire? The one with the baby?" He nodded. "I need to ask you about Sophie Perry." Stephanie stepped outside, arms crossed. "Took you long enough." Finley was taken aback. "You knew?" "I knew she was a snake the day she poured bleach in the laundry bin to get rid of the Latina maid," Stephanie said. "But nobody listened. We were just the staff. She ran that house like a queen and made sure anyone she didn't like didn't last." Finley felt his stomach twist. She hated women like Lindsay. Rosalind continued. "Smart, black, good with the kid. Sophie couldn't stand it, especially after the boy started reaching for Lindsay instead of her. She poisoned Lindsay," Finley said. "I'm not surprised." They stood in silence for a moment, the chill of the night creeping into their bones. "You got a good one," Rosalind added, softening. "Don't let your guilt drown her. She's stronger than you think, but even strong women break if they're left cleaning up messes they didn't make." Finley nodded, thanked her, and drove home in silence. The next morning, Lindsay arrived earlier than usual. She carried a small basket of fresh muffins she'd baked that morning, banana walnut, Beckham's favorite. When she walked in, she noticed something new in the air. Finley had rearranged the nursery. The stiff, sterile lines were gone. The cold blue-gray walls had been softened with pastel art prints. There was now a second rocking chair by the crib, a low shelf of sensory toys, a tiny record player in the corner with a few children's vinyls. She turned slowly, touched by the effort. "Did you hire a designer?" she teased. Finley stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "No, I just listened to you." Lindsay smiled gently. "He'll like this. I was thinking," Finley added, "about everything, about Sophie, about you and Beckham." He stepped inside, holding a printed page. "I'm withdrawing from the civil case," he said. "The police are handling the criminal side, but I'm also donating to a domestic care advocacy fund, one that supports black women working in white-majority households. It'll be named after someone who made me see clearer." Lindsay took the paper. Her name was at the top. The Lindsay Foster Fellowship for Domestic Justice. She didn't speak for a moment. Then, "That's a start." Finley smiled faintly. "We're getting good at starting." Later that afternoon, Beckham took his first unassisted step. It was wobbly, barely more than a shuffle, but Lindsay gasped, dropped to her knees, and cheered like he'd won the Boston Marathon. Beckham beamed. Finley watched from the hallway, heart pounding in a way that surprised him. Not from fear, but from awe. He had missed so many firsts. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to miss the rest. That night, as Lindsay prepared to leave, Finley walked her to the door. "There's something else I haven't told you," he said. Lindsay turned, curious. "I know who reported you." "Back when you were working at West Point Medical." Lindsay froze. "That file was sealed. I unsealed it." She stepped back. "Why?" "Because I wanted the truth, not for leverage, for healing." Lindsay's throat tightened. "And what did you find?" Finley met her eyes. "You were protecting a patient, not harming them." "Oh." Tears welled in her eyes. Unbidden. They made it look like I crossed a line. "I know, and I'm sorry they did. It ends here." Lindsay nodded, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't hug him. She didn't need to. Sometimes justice didn't come with applause or headlines. Sometimes it came in the quiet honesty of a changed man. It was a Thursday evening when the past came knocking quietly, politely, with no warning at all. The sky outside the Walters estate was streaked in amber and lavender as the sun slipped behind the trees. Inside, Beckham was asleep early, worn out from a day full of laughter, finger painting, and a visit to the botanical gardens. Lindsay had taken dozens of pictures on her phone. Beckham squatting beside a lily, his tiny hands muddy, his mouth open in awe. She sat now in the study, scrolling through them, smiling without realizing it. Finlay was nearby, sorting through documents and sipping a rare glass of whiskey. A comfortable silence lingered between them, interrupted only by the soft ticking of the antique clock and the occasional creak of old floorboards settling. Then the doorbell rang. Lindsay looked up. "Expecting someone?" Finlay frowned. No. He rose and she followed him into the entry hall. The cameras had already lit up on the security screen by the door. A woman stood outside, middle-aged, sharp-suited, her expression unreadable. Finlay opened the door, cautious. "Mr. Walters?" she asked, with the clipped tone of someone used to command. "That's me," she extended a badge. "Detective Hudson Hunter, NYPD. May I come in?" Finlay hesitated, then stepped aside. Lindsay lingered by the stairs, watching, heart quickening. "I'm following up on the Sophie Perry case," Hunter said, stepping inside and scanning the opulence with disinterest. Specifically, new statements from a witness. "Stephanie Gregory?" Finlay asked. "Yes. Her deposition helped us move the investigation forward," Hunter confirmed. "But something else came up. Something that needs your attention." Lindsay stepped forward slightly. "What kind of something?" Hunter glanced at her, then back at Finlay. "It's about Beckham's birth." The room seemed to still be there. Finlay's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Hunter reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. "Do you mind if we sit?" They gathered in the parlor. Lindsay, Finlay, and the detective seated in stiff leather chairs. Hunter slid the envelope across the table. "This contains a report we obtained from West Point Medical where your son was born. We've matched signatures, timestamps, and we verified the lab results included." Finlay opened the envelope slowly. Inside, pages of medical records, a birth certificate, and a DNA report. The blood drained from his face. "What? What is this?" he murmured. Lindsay leaned over gently, her hand brushing his. Her eyes scanned the top line of the report and she froze. "Paternity test result. 0% probability of relation." Finlay stared at the page like it had betrayed him. "No," he whispered. "I'm sorry," Hunter said gently. "It appears Beckham may not be biologically yours." Lindsay's breath hitched. "But he looks like you." Finlay shook his head, stunned. "He has Lydia's nose." Her eyes. "Lydia listed you as the father," Hunter continued. "But there are inconsistencies in her admission form. Records show she had been seeing another man unofficially during the last months of her pregnancy. Someone from her grief counseling group." Finlay stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. "No," he muttered. "No, she wouldn't do that." Lindsay rose, moving toward him. "Finlay?" I raised him. He snapped, then caught himself and lowered his voice. "I was there from the second he was born. I buried Lydia. I held that baby in my arms. I gave him everything." "Nothing changes that," Lindsay said softly. Finlay covered his face with his hands. "But everything does change, doesn't it?" Detective Hunter gave them a moment before clearing her throat. "There's more. We found out that Sophie may have known. She had access to the hospital's internal files. There are emails, old ones, deleted, but recoverable. She might have used the information to manipulate staff, including Lindsay." Lindsay's stomach sank. "So, this wasn't just about me being the wrong skin color." "No," Hunter said quietly. "It was about power. She knew the foundation was built on a secret, and she wanted to keep control." Finlay dropped into the armchair, utterly deflated. "Why didn't Lydia tell me?" Lindsay didn't have an answer, only silence. Hunter stood. "We're not here to destroy your life, but truth has a way of showing up even when it's unwelcome." She handed Finlay a card. "If you want to contest guardianship or need legal protections, call me. But I'll tell you what I've seen in my line of work. Mr. Walters' biology doesn't make it apparent. Presence does." She left quietly. The front door clicked shut behind her, leaving the house eerily still. Lindsay sat beside Finley, unsure what to say. He looked lost, truly lost. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "What? Raising him, loving him all this time?" He turned to her slowly. "How can I regret the only thing that's ever made sense in my life?" She nodded, blinking back tears. "Then that's your answer." They sat in silence for what felt like an hour. Finally, Finley spoke again. "Will he ever need to know?" Lindsay's voice trembled, but was steady. "One day, when he's old enough to understand that love isn't written in blood, it's lived." Finley reached for her hand. This time she let him, not out of pity, but out of shared pain and something else, something forming quietly between grief and grace. Upstairs, Beckham stirred, calling for her in a sleepy voice. "Lindsay," she rose, her hand still in Finley's for just a second longer. "You're still his father," she said. "That doesn't change because a paper says otherwise." And then she climbed the stairs. Each step is solid, steady, sacred. Finley didn't sleep that night. He sat in the den long after the lights had gone out, the soft blue glow of the fireplace flickering against the decanter of untouched bourbon on the table beside him. The paternity test report lay crumpled in his hand, not torn, not thrown, just clenched, as if his grip could hold back the unraveling truth. Upstairs, Lindsay moved quietly through the hallway. She had settled Beckham after his whimpering cries and now lingered just outside Finley's office. Something told her not to knock yet, not until he was ready. By morning, the air had changed again. Not like the heavy rains from days before this, was the eerie calm before a different kind of storm. The estate was quiet but not peaceful. Finley emerged just past 8 a.m., unshaven and hollow-eyed, but composed. He wore a grey cashmere sweater and dark slacks, and there was a kind of deliberate control in every movement he made. Lindsay stood in the kitchen helping Beckham with his cereal. When she saw Finley, her hands still pulled on the spoon. Beckham, sensing the tension, looked between the two of them and then smiled tentatively. "Daddy," he said softly. Finley froze. Lindsay held her breath. Finley stepped forward slowly, crouched beside Beckham, and placed a hand gently on his back. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice. "Are you hungry?" Beckham nodded. His curls bounced. Finley kissed the top of his head. That was all Ma needed to see. Later that morning, Finley met with his lawyer, Wesley Jensen, in the study. "I'm not contesting anything," Finley said firmly. "He's my son. I don't care what the test says." Jensen, a man in his 60 seconds with sharp eyes and a gentler voice, nodded. "Then we'll file the guardianship affirmation. That'll make things airtight. Make it known that if anyone tries to question Lindsay's position in this house again, they'll be answering me," Finley added. "I'm done watching good people get punished for my blindness." Shaw scribbled notes and paused. "And the trust fund," Finley exhaled. "Increase it and name Lindsay as co-trustee. If anything ever happens to me, she'll know what to do." In the afternoon, Lindsay stepped out to visit her mother, bringing Beckham with her. Michelle lived in a modest apartment above a florist in Queens, and despite the small space, Beckham lit it up like sunlight through an old window. "He looks stronger," Michelle said, cradling him on her lap. "Brighter he is," Lindsay said softly, but her voice carried a weight that made her mother look up. "What is it, honey?" Lindsay hesitated. "Finley found out Beckham isn't biologically his." Michelle blinked. "Oh, yeah. Does it change how he treats the boy?" "No," Lindsay said immediately. "If anything, he's more present now, like the truth made him stop hiding behind his grief." Michelle nodded slowly. "Sometimes it takes losing the illusion to finally love the reality." Lindsay wiped a tear from her eye. "I'm scared, Mama. Scared I'm getting too close. That this is more than just work. That I'm feeling something I shouldn't." Michelle placed a hand over hers. "You're not feeling anything wrong, baby. You're feeling something earned." That night, back at the estate, Finley and Lindsay sat outside on the stone terrace. The sky above them was wide and dark, the stars only faintly visible through the city haze. A citronella candle flickered on the table between them. "Thank you," Finley said. "For what?" Lindsay asked. "For not leaving. For staying, when I didn't deserve it." Lindsay shook her head. "I didn't stay for you." "I know, but you stayed, and that changed everything." A beat passed. Then Lindsay asked, "Do you believe in fate?" Finley looked at her. "I used to believe in control, that if I planned everything right, no one I loved would ever suffer again. And now I believe some things happen to break that illusion," he said. "And sometimes what breaks us also puts us back together." She turned away slightly, her heart thudding hard in her chest. "I found a letter from Lydia," Finley said suddenly. Lindsay looked at him surprised. It was in the nursery, hidden behind one of the bookshelves, dated a week before she died. He reached into his sweater pocket and handed her a worn piece of stationery. Lindsay unfolded it carefully, eyes scanning the neat cursive. "Finley, if something happens to me, I need you to know that I chose love. Whatever the truth is about Beckham's blood, it doesn't matter. He is ours. Raise him with kindness and don't shut yourself away. Let someone in. Let someone love you back." Lindsay's hands trembled. Finley watched her, his voice quiet. "She knew, and she wanted me to forgive." "Uh-huh." Lindsay blinked, tears catching on her lashes. "I'm not asking for anything from you," he added. "No promises, no answers tonight. Just stay, please." She reached across the table, took his hand, and held it without speaking. Upstairs, Beckham slept with his stuffed elephant curled in the crook of his arm. In the silence of that October evening, something shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough. Enough to believe that healing, like grief, comes in layers. That love doesn't always look like a thunderclap. Sometimes it's a whisper in the dark. The first frost of November touched the gardens by dawn. The Walters estate, always poised, always pristine, wore a thin shimmer of ice on its window panes, and the air smelled of chimney smoke and distant wood. Inside, however, the quiet was beginning to shift. What once was stillness had become anticipation, a waiting. Lindsay could feel it. Not fear, not yet, but something else stirring beneath the surface. Beckham had begun speaking more. His words came slowly, half-formed and soft, but they were real. This morning, he pointed at his juice and clearly said, "Red cup." Lindsay nearly cried. Finley had been there too, and when he looked at Lindsay, it wasn't with surprise anymore. It was pride, shared pride, the kind that comes not from watching something happen, but from helping make it happen. Still, neither of them said what was now blooming between them. Not directly. Not yet. Later that morning, Lindsay stood in the foyer, adjusting her scarf and coat, readying Beckham for a quick walk through the park. Finley walked in from the hallway, phone in hand, his expression tight. "Problem?" Lindsay asked. Finley hesitated. "A call from the legal department. Someone's filed an anonymous complaint." She tensed. "About what?" He lowered his voice. "They're claiming Beckham is being exposed to an unfit caretaker with a record of professional misconduct." Lindsay's heart sank. "They're coming after me." Finley nodded, jaw clenched. "It's not going to stick. I'll handle it." But Lindsay shook her head. "This doesn't feel random. This feels coordinated." Finley looked up sharply. "Sophie, she's in custody." Lindsay reminded him. "That doesn't mean she's alone." A silence fell between them. "You think someone else in this house was helping her?" she asked. "I think," Finley said slowly. "We've only scraped the surface." That afternoon, while Beckham napped in his stroller during their walk, Lindsay stopped at the old church on 58th Street, a modest stone building tucked between two brownstones. It smelled of candles, old wood, and hunter air. Inside, she sat in the back pew, hands clasped in her lap. She wasn't particularly religious, not in the traditional sense, but something about the space always calmed her. It reminded her of her grandmother's voice, soft and certain in the dark, telling her that truth always finds its way home. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Please protect him. Protect us." Behind her, a woman entered quietly and sat a few rows ahead. She turned slightly, catching Lindsay's eye. "Long day?" the woman asked gently. Lindsay smiled faintly. "Something like that," the woman nodded. "When the world turns its back on you, sometimes you just need a moment of stillness to hear what your own heart is saying." Lindsay didn't reply, but she let the words linger. Back at the estate, Finley began reviewing household employment records with a newfound scrutiny. He pored over background checks, hiring documents, and old disciplinary memos. Most of it looked clean, except for one thing. Bentley, the driver, Sophie's nephew. Finley hadn't made the connection before. The surname was different, but the middle name, Bentley Webb Perry, had been buried in the legal file. He picked up the phone. "Wesley, I need a background check. Deep on Bentley Perry. Full employment history, contacts, financials, and put someone on surveillance." Now, by the time Lindsay returned home with Beckham, the frost had melted from the lawn, but the air was colder. Finley met her at the door. "We need to talk." She followed him into the study and listened as he explained. Bentley's been with the family 2 years, came highly recommended, but his connection to Sophie wasn't listed. She likely forged that part of his file. "Why would she do that?" Lindsay asked. "Because she needed someone on the inside," Finley replied, "someone to help her monitor the household while keeping distance. And now that she's out of the picture, I think Bentley's trying to finish what she started." Lindsay sat down, processing. "You think he's the one who filed the complaint?" she asked. Finley nodded. "And more. I think he's been watching us, maybe even feeding information to the press." Suddenly, everything clicked for Lindsay. The odd glances, the time she found Beckham's routine slightly off, the missed appointments, little things too small to notice in the moment. But now, patterns. "What do we do?" she asked. "We get ahead of it," Finley said. "We gather proof. We don't just fire him. We expose him." Lindsay nodded. "Then we do it right. No more shadows." That night, Finley sat with Beckham in the nursery while Lindsay reviewed the household camera system. Every clip, every time stamp, every anomaly. Then she found it. Footage from 3 nights ago. Bentley standing outside the nursery at 1:12 a.m. He didn't enter, just stood there, watching. Then slowly, he bent down out of frame before slipping something under the nursery door. Lindsay's heart slammed in her chest. She ran upstairs, burst into the nursery, and dropped to her knees. Her hands searched along the floorboard. Beneath the edge of the rug, she found it. A small, folded piece of paper, smudged, handwritten. "The boy's not safe. You should have left. E." She took it downstairs to Finley, her hands shaking. He read the note, then looked up at her, his face hardening. "That's it," he said. "We're calling security. I want this man out tonight." "No," Ma said quietly. "Not yet." Finley blinked. "What?" "We set a trap," she said. "If we catch him in the act, it won't just be hearsay. It'll be irrefutable." Finley studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, let's end this." Outside, the wind began to howl, and the first flakes of snow drifted from the sky. The storm wasn't coming. It had already begun. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in control deception. Finley Walters, CEO, billionaire, and grieving father, put on his oldest suit. The kind he hadn't worn since before Lydia's passing. The kind he'd kept in a dust bag in the back of the closet. He told the household staff he had an impromptu investor dinner in Manhattan and would be staying at the penthouse overnight. Lindsay, in turn, made a show of bundling Beckham for a supposed overnight stay with her mother in Queens. She packed his little duffel bag, made a point to carry it through the foyer, and kissed him on the forehead in full view of the cameras before walking out the front door. But they didn't leave the property. Beckham was quietly settled into the safe room, an emergency hideaway designed after the estate's first renovation. Only Finley and Lindsay knew the code. Now, inside, a crib, filtered air, cameras, emergency supplies, and Lindsay herself seated in the armchair watching the monitor. Finley, meanwhile, remained on the second floor, hidden in the study, keeping the interior security grid offline, except for specific motion-triggered zones. The bait had been set. Now they waited. Bentley arrived just after 3 p.m. The driver parked the estate's Range Rover in its usual spot and walked through the back gate like he did every evening after his off-duty hours. But tonight, instead of heading toward the staff quarters, he hesitated, paused, then glanced toward the main house. He didn't know he was being watched from 5 different angles. Finley monitored his steps on the master control screen. Bentley's pattern didn't match his normal routine. He circled the property twice, checked the back entrances, paused at the east conservatory door, where Lindsay usually read in the evenings. Then finally, he slipped inside using a key he wasn't supposed to have. Finley muttered under his breath, "You idiot." "Oh, downstairs." Lindsay's voice came over the secure comms. "He's inside. I'm seeing movement on camera 4. Copy that, Finley replied. Bentley moved fast, but not recklessly. He knew where the blind spots were, or thought he did. He headed up the servants' stairwell, bypassing the hallway cameras. Finley watched his shadow flicker across the foyer, then reappear on the second floor. And then Bentley made a mistake. He turned into Beckham's nursery. Finley sprang into action. Bentley crept into the room, expecting silence. He'd assumed the child was out of the house, the room dark, unoccupied. He didn't see Finley step in behind him. Gunnery not to kill, but to ensure obedience. Step away from the crib, Finley said coldly. Bentley froze, then turned slowly. I don't know what you think you're doing, sir. Cut the act, Finley snapped. You left a note under my son's door. You've been feeding intel to Sophie, and you've just broken into my home. That's a felony. Bentley's mask dropped. His voice turned bitter. You think you're untouchable just because you have money? You have no idea what she gave up for this house. What she sacrificed? Finley narrowed his eyes. Sophie, she raised you, cleaned up your messes, watched you grow while your parents let the staff do the parenting. And then you bring in her. He spat some charity case and scrubs who thinks baking waffles makes her a mother. Da. Finley stepped forward, fury simmering beneath his skin. You drugged her. You watched my son while plotting to harm him. I protected the legacy, Bentley hissed. No, Finley said with ice in his voice. You tried to erase the future. Lindsay appeared behind him, then silent, steady, Beckham's monitor in hand. Police are on their way, she said. You might want to sit down before they put you on the floor. Bentley turned to run, but 2 estate security officers blocked the door. Within minutes, he was cuffed, Mirandazed, and removed from the property. Lindsay stood in the nursery doorway, watching it all happen in stunned silence. When it was over, Finley turned to her. You okay? He asked. She nodded, still breathless. I didn't think it would end like this, Finley exhaled. Neither did I. They stood in Beckham's room, surrounded by soft toys and pale blue walls. And for a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lindsay whispered, What now? The next morning, the house was eerily quiet again. Not from fear this time, but from exhaustion, from release. Lindsay sat in the garden, Beckham asleep in her lap, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. She rocked him gently while Finley poured them both coffee from the kitchen thermos. He handed her a mug, sat across from her on the bench. The sun was rising slowly, washing the trees in gold. I filed the restraining order, he said. And I've added a clause in my will. If anything happens to me, Beckham goes to you. No debates, no courts. Lindsay looked up sharply. Finley, I mean it, he said. I've lived in too many houses where people whispered about race, about class, about who deserves to be there, and I'm done with it. Lindsay's throat tightened. Finley leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I spent years building walls so high I couldn't see my own son behind them. And you walked in not with a battering ram, but with a bottle, a song, and your heart wide open. She laughed softly. You make me sound like a folk song. He smiled. Maybe you are. Then he grew quiet. I want to ask you something. She looked up, waiting. I want you to stay, not his staff, not as Beckham's caretaker, but his family. However long it takes, however you define it. Lindsay's lips parted, the words catching in her chest. Finley continued, voice low. You don't have to answer now. I just needed to say it. Lindsay looked down at Beckham. His tiny fingers curled around her thumb. I don't have an answer, she said. But I do have a reason, Finley blinked. A reason? She met his gaze to stay, and that's more than I had before. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't let go. For the first time in months, the Walters estate felt like a place where breath could come easy. The shadows that once clung to its corners, whispers of suspicion, resentment, unspoken pain, had started to clear. What remained was quiet, yes, but not the heavy, aching kind. This was stillness born from truth, and truth finally was enough. Lindsay stood on the front steps in the early morning light, steaming mug in hand, watching the leaves swirl across the lawn. The city was beginning to wind up for the holiday season. Stores downtown were hanging lights. Coffee shops switched to peppermint mochas, and for the first time in years, she didn't dread Hunter. Behind her, Beckham's small feet padded across the marble floor. She heard him before she saw him, his soft murmur, like a question, not of biology but of trust. She turned. He reached up and she scooped him into her arms, warm and sleepy. "Mama," he said again, more certain. Lindsay froze. Tears stung her eyes. Finley, who just entered the study, heard it too. They locked eyes. He didn't speak and didn't need to. Later that morning, Finley received a visit from Wesley Jensen. They met in the sunroom, a space Lydia used to keep orchids, now converted into a sitting area with books, warm rugs, and a fire that burned low in the corner. Wesley, always the gentleman, removed his hat and took the armchair opposite Finley. "The adoption paperwork is ready," Wesley said. "We'll move forward once Lindsay confirms." Finley hesitated. "I haven't asked her yet. I mean formally May." Wesley arched a brow. "Why not?" Finley ran a hand through his hair. "Because she's not just some piece in this puzzle. She's the one who held it all together when I was falling apart. I want her to say yes for her own reasons, not because it makes sense on paper." Wesley smiled faintly. "You know, Finley, I've worked for your family for over 30 years. Watch you grow into the man your father never figured out how to be. All of this. It's not about power anymore. It's about legacy. Bah." Finley looked toward the hallway where he could faintly hear Beckham giggling in Lindsay's arms. "I don't want a legacy built on silence," he said. "I want one built on truth." That evening, Lindsay found an envelope tucked under her bedroom door. No signature, just her name in careful cursive. Inside was a letter. "Lindsay, I've rewritten this letter 3 times trying to get it right. The truth is, there's no perfect way to ask someone to become the soul of your family. You've already done the impossible. You brought light back into a house that had forgotten how to feel. You taught my son to smile without fear. And you taught me that grief doesn't have to harden a man. It can break him open. Beckham chose you long before I knew I had. He sees you for who you are, and I'm trying to catch up. So, I'm asking not as your employer, but as a father who owes you more than words. Will you adopt Beckham with me? Not because we need to sign a form, but because you already are his mother. Whatever your answer is, this door stays open, Finley." Lindsay folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest. No one had ever said words like that to her. Not with that much tenderness. She walked to the nursery, found Beckham asleep, his tiny fingers wrapped around the edge of his blanket. She touched his cheek, leaned close, and whispered, "Yes." Then she stepped into the hallway. Finley was there, waiting. He didn't say anything, neither did she. She just nodded once, firm, steady. "Yes," she said again. "I'll do it." Finley exhaled, and in that breath, something inside him melted. The following week moved quickly. Court documents were filed, appointments made, interviews scheduled. But for Beckham, life remained sweetly simple. Books with Lindsay, building blocks with Finley, and the sound of music coming from the kitchen as they danced around preparing dinner. At night, Lindsay tucked him in with a new song she made up, gentle and winding like the Mississippi River her grandmother used to talk about. And every time she sang the word home, Beckham smiled in his sleep. One evening, as snow began to fall for the first time that Hunter, Finley found Lindsay sitting on the front porch, wrapped in a shawl, sipping tea. He joined her in silence. After a while, he asked, "Do you think Lydia would have approved?" Lindsay didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I think she's been waiting for you to forgive yourself and to stop thinking you have to earn happiness through pain." He nodded slowly. "She didn't die so you could bury yourself." Lindsay continued, "She died, and you survived. And that's not guilt to carry. That's grace to honor." Finley turned to her voice softly. "What about us?" She looked over at him. And, for the first time, she didn't hold back. "I love him," she said. "That's where it started. But somewhere along the way, I think I started loving you too." Finley's breath hitched. He reached for her hand, and in that still moment, beneath the falling snow and the amber glow of the porch light, she let him hold it. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But something had begun. Not from urgency, but from truth. The holiday season arrived on 5th Avenue with a parade of lights, Hudson S., and red-cheeked children pointing up at the department store windows. but at the Walters estate. The glow came not from the outside world, but from within. The tree had been set up in the grand hall, a 12-foot Douglas fir shipped from Vermont, the kind Finley remembered from his childhood, but had stopped putting up after Lydia passed. Now it stood tall again, covered in golden lights and family ornaments once buried in the attic. Lindsay had unearthed them one by one, hand-painted glass balls. Beckham's first handprint, a small wooden dove with Lydia's name engraved on it. Finley had stood behind her as she decorated, silent but reverent. She would have liked this. Lindsay had whispered. She would have liked you, he said almost inaudibly. And then, for the first time in a long while, they laughed together, gently, without waiting. But peace has a way of drawing out the things you thought you'd buried. The knock came late, just after 10 p.m., while Beckham was asleep and the house was still. Finley answered the door himself. The man on the porch was in his 50 seconds, maybe early 60 seconds, his coat too thin for the weather, his eyes sunken and hollow. He held his hat in his hands, voice trembling. "I'm sorry to come like this," he said, "but I think Beckham might be my son." Finley stared at him. Lindsay, who had come downstairs with a mug of cocoa, froze behind the staircase column. "What did you say?" Finley's voice dropped tight and cold. The man nodded, swallowing hard. "My name's Luke Porter. I knew Lydia years ago. I was in her grief counseling group. I never knew she was pregnant until after she passed. I didn't know the child survived." Finley's jaw clenched. "You're lying." Luke shook his head. "I have nothing to gain from this. I'm not here to take him. I just needed to know. I needed to see him." Lindsay stepped forward before Finley could explode. "What proof do you have?" she asked calmly. Luke reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph yellowed soft at the corners. It was of him and Lydia seated on a bench in Central Park. She looked peaceful, tired, but smiling. "I kept this," he whispered, "because it was the last time she ever called me by name." Lindsay took the photo, her fingers trembling. Finley didn't move. "I can do a test," Luke added. "No quartz, no trouble. I just want to know the truth, and then I'll leave." Finley finally spoke. "He has a father, and it's me. I'm not trying to take him," Luke said again. "But if I'm his blood, I just want to know that he's okay, that she didn't keep him from me out of fear." Lindsay glanced at Finley. His knuckles were white at his side. "Let us think about it," she said quietly. Luke nodded. "I'll leave my number. I'll wait however long it takes." Then he stepped off the porch and disappeared into the snow. Back inside, Finley slammed the door. "No," he said, pacing. "No, we're not doing this." Lindsay didn't respond. This man shows up out of nowhere now after everything, and suddenly he's supposed to have a place in this house. "He didn't demand a place," Lindsay said. "He asked for the truth." "The truth is, Beckham is mine," Finley snapped. "He always will be." Lindsay placed the photo on the table. "Finley, are you angry because he might be Beckham's father, or because he reminded you that you're not?" The silence was sharp. Finley exhaled hard and turned away. "I'm angry because everything I've rebuilt could fall apart, and I'm finally starting to believe we could be a whole." Lindsay walked to him slowly. "Truth doesn't destroy the house, Finley. It just forces you to reinforce the foundation." He closed his eyes. "I'll handle the test," she said, "if that's okay." "Oh." Finley opened his eyes, and there was something behind them. Fear. Real human fear. The kind a man carries when he's been heard too many times. "I don't want to lose him," he whispered. "You won't," she said. "Not if you keep loving him the way you already do." The test was done quietly without fanfare. A private lab, no media, no documents filed to court. Just a swab from Beckham and one from Luke collected under Lindsay's supervision. While they waited, life continued quiet, delicate. They celebrated Beckham's 3rd birthday with a cupcake tower and a train set Finley had picked out himself. Lindsay made a chocolate cake from her mother's recipe, and when Beckham smeared it on his face, Finley leaned down and wiped it clean without a word. Love, real love, was no longer something Finley questioned. It just was. A week later, the results arrived. Lindsay opened the envelope alone. Then she handed it to Finley. He stared at the paper for a long time. Joe, 87% probability of biological relation. Luke Porter, biological father. Finley read it twice, then folded it neatly. I need a minute, he said. She nodded and let him go. Finley stood on the back porch, the cold air searing his lungs. He had always feared that blood would take something from him, but the truth was it hadn't. Beckham was still the boy who called him Daddy. Lindsay was still the woman who held them both together, and he was still the man who chose to stay. That night Finley called Luke. His voice was even. I got the results. AOA. I'm not asking for anything, Luke said. I promise, Finley nodded. Even though the man couldn't see him, I want you to meet him. Luke's breath caught. What? I want Beckham to grow up knowing who he came from, but also who raised him. There's space for both if we're careful, Luke whispered. Thank you. Finley hung up, turned around, and saw Lindsay standing behind him. You did the right thing, she said. Doesn't make it easier, he replied. No, she agreed, but it makes it good. They stood in silence, breath misting into the night, and somewhere in the house behind them, a child slept safe between two truths. The meeting took place in the garden room. Finley insisted on it. Not in a courtroom, not in a sterile office with attorneys and harsh fluorescent lights, but here, where the walls were glass, the light was soft, and Beckham's favorite toy trains lined the edge of the windowsill. Luke Porter arrived wearing the same coat he'd worn that snowy night. He had it pressed now, buttoned to the collar, his shoes polished, hair combed neatly back. It was clear he'd spent time preparing not just for the meeting, but for being seen as something more than the past. Lindsay sat with Beckham on the floor, quietly helping him build a tower of wooden blocks, while Finley stood near the fireplace. Arms crossed, not in judgment, but in protection. When Luke walked in, he didn't rush. He didn't reach for Beckham. He simply stopped at a respectful distance and looked at the child. Beckham looked up, his soft curls falling over his forehead. His eyes were curious, not fearful. Luke smiled. Hi, Beckham, he said softly. Beckham blinked, then pointed at the tower he had built. Luke stepped closer. That's a good one. Did you build it all by yourself? Beckham nodded once. Serious? Luke lowered himself to a crouch. Careful, slow. I used to build towers like that when I was little too. Mine always fell over. Beckham smiled shyly. From across the room, Lindsay held her breath. Finley's eyes never left them. They kept the visit short. 30 minutes. That was all Finley had agreed to. 30 minutes of polite introductions, gentle conversation, and guarded observation. But by the end of it, Beckham had handed Luke a small blue train, the one he never shared with anyone, and Luke, stunned, had accepted it with trembling hands. After Luke left, Finley stood outside alone, arms tied around himself as the wind brushed against his face. Lindsay joined him after tucking Beckham into bed. He didn't push, she said. No, Finley replied. He didn't. No, he's not trying to replace you. I know. Lindsay looked at him for a long moment. So why does it still hurt? Finley didn't answer right away. Then in a voice so low it nearly vanished, he said, Because I never got to be first. Not really. Not with Lydia. Not with Beckham. I was always the man who showed up second. Lindsay stepped closer. But you're the one who stayed. Finley's eyes glistened. What if that's not enough? It's more than enough, she whispered. Because staying is a choice. Biology isn't. That night Finley did something he hadn't done in years. He opened Lydia's journals. They had been packed away in the cedar trunk at the foot of their old bed. He hadn't dared touch them since the accident, afraid of what they might confirm, or worse, what they might deny. But now, with the truth out in the open, he needed more than legal documents. He needed her words. Page after page, he read about her grief group, her depression, her regrets, and her love. I don't know how to tell Finley that Beckham might not be his, but in my heart, I already see Finley as Beckham's father. He has steadiness in his eyes that Luke never had. He has tenderness that makes me feel safe when I'm falling apart. If I don't make it, if this illness gets worse, I pray Lindsay finds them both. She's the only person I've seen bring light into this house since the accident. There's something in her. It's not just kindness, it's healing. Finley closed the book, his heart raw and wide open. He looked up at the ceiling, whispered, I wish you'd told me, but in truth, maybe she had, just in a different way. The next morning, Finley called Luke. "I want to set up visits," he said. "Once a month in this house. No secrets, no claims, just space. Space for Beckham to understand where he came from without losing where he is." Luke's voice cracked. "I'd be honored. And when he's older," Finley added, "well, tell him everything together." Luke was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "That boy is lucky to have not one but two men who love him enough to do what's hard." Finley exhaled. "Yeah, I guess he is." Lindsay watched them from the window as they hung lights together that weekend, Finley on a ladder. Luke handed him clips. The two men are not yet friends, but no longer rivals. She felt something bloom in her chest. Not victory, not relief, but family. Not in the way she had imagined it as a girl growing up in Queens. No picture-perfect dinner tables. No TV-ready laughter, but something deeper woven through pain and patience, through forgiveness, through the quiet strength of choosing one another every day. Later, she tucked Beckham into bed and sat beside him, stroking his curls. "Do you feel happy, sweetheart?" she asked softly. He nodded, sleepy. "I have two daddies," he murmured. Lindsay smiled, tears forming. "Yes," she whispered. "You do." Downstairs, Finley sat by the fire, a mug of cocoa in his hands. Lindsay joined him, curling up beside him under the thick wool blanket. She laid her head on his shoulder. He didn't speak, neither did she. Outside, the snow began to fall again, dusting the trees, the rooftop, the lawn. And inside the house, this house built on grief, on legacy, on second chances, love stayed quietly, like a flame that no longer needed to roar to stay alive. The morning after the first true blizzard of the season blanketed the city, the Walters estate stood quiet beneath a heavy sky. Thick snow weighed down the tree branches, softening every edge. The world outside looked fragile, as if even sound dared not disturb it. Inside, warmth ruled. Lindsay stood in the kitchen in her thick socks and favorite sweater, flipping pancakes while Beckham sat on the counter beside her, legs swinging, chattering softly to his stuffed lion. Finley entered in flannel and a smile hair, messy the way it got when he slept hard and peacefully. "Snowed in?" he said, kissing Lindsay's cheek. "Can't think of a better place to be," she replied. He stole a pancake from the plate and Beckham scolded him. "Daddy? Ask." They all laughed. By late morning, the house felt wrapped in velvet soft light, low music, the fireplace in the den crackling faintly. Finley and Lindsay took turns reading to Beckham. They built a makeshift fort in the living room, its roof made of bedsheets and imagination, and tucked themselves inside with snacks and silly voices. It was in the middle of this domestic haven when Beckham had just nodded off between two pillows that the doorbell rang. Finley tensed immediately. Lindsay's body stiffened. No one had expected. He slipped out of the fort, careful not to wake Beckham, and made his way to the door. Two men stood outside, bundled in dark coats. No smiles, no badges showing, but Finley knew the look. He stepped out, pulling the door half shut behind him. "Yes." One of the men held up a leather wallet. "Agent Scott. This is Agent Stewart. We're with the Department of Child Protection Investigations. We received an anonymous report concerning the welfare of Beckham Walters." Finley's voice dropped. "Excuse me." The report indicated that the child is living with individuals who are not his biological parents, that there may have been manipulation in legal guardianship processes, and that a history of misconduct exists regarding his caregiver. Finley's fists clenched at his sides. "Lindsay Foster," Scott clarified. "She's listed as a former employee. There's a record of a prior complaint filed under her name. That complaint was dismissed," Finley said firmly, "without merit. You're walking into something that's already been handled." Agent Stewart stepped forward. "We understand, but we're obligated to follow up. We'll need to speak with Miss Foster. And we'd like to see the child." Finley's voice turned to steel, not without a warrant. The agents exchanged a glance. Lindsay appeared behind him, then, calm, composed, Beckham, still asleep in her arms. "I'll speak to them," she said. Finley turned to her, voice low. "You don't have to." She nodded once. "Yes, I do." They sat at the kitchen table. The agents asked their questions in a clinical, pointed, emotionless way. Lindsay answered everyone with grace. Yes, she was a former nurse. No, she had no criminal record. Yes, a previous household filed a complaint, but it was later found to be retaliation for reporting abuse in the home. She provided the name of her lawyer. She offered to share court documents. Then gently she asked, "May I ask who filed this report?" The agents hesitated. Anonymous. But Finlay saw the flicker. "Was it male or female?" he asked. Klein didn't answer, but his eyes betrayed him. Finlay's jaw tightened. It was Sophie, or someone working with her. "I'm afraid we can't confirm." "I can," Finlay snapped. "Because this is the third attempt to discredit Lindsay's place in this house, and if you're going to accuse a woman of being a threat to a child's safety, you better be damn sure you're not being used." Silence. Then Lindsay placed Beckham's hand gently over hers on the table. "I'm not asking you to believe me," she said, voice steady. "I'm asking you to watch how he looks at me." The agents turned to Beckham, now awake, rubbing his eyes sleepily. When he saw Lindsay, he reached for her, climbed into her lap, and laid his head on her chest with the complete trust of a child who knew exactly where home was. They didn't stay long after that. They left with quiet words and muted apologies, and Finlay stood at the window long after their car disappeared. That night, after the fort came down and the day's tension had given way to exhaustion, Finlay poured 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to Lindsay on the couch and sat beside her. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For not seeing sooner how hard it is to live in a house where your place can be questioned just for existing." Lindsay looked down. "It's not new. It's just more painful when it happens somewhere that finally feels like home." Finlay took her hand. "I can't erase what people see when they look at you, but I can make damn sure they also see what I see." "What's that?" "A woman who saved me and raised my son and stood through every storm." Lindsay smiled faintly. "We're not done with the storms yet." "No," he said, "but now we stand in them together." Later, in the quiet of their room, Finlay looked through the security footage again, rechecking entrances, calls, logs, and then he saw something. 2 days before the visit, a call had been made from a blocked number, from a location just outside the estate. He traced it, and his blood ran cold. It wasn't Sophie. It wasn't Luke. It was someone else. Someone who used to work for the Walters long before Lydia. Before Beckham. A man with a grudge. A man who had once been dismissed for inappropriate behavior around a young Finlay. The ghosts weren't finished yet. Finlay turned to Lindsay, his voice grave. This wasn't the end. She looked up from her book. It was the beginning of the final fight. The next morning dawned bleak and grey, with sleet tapping against the windows, like an impatient warning. In the Walters estate, the air felt thick, as if the house itself sensed that something was coming, a reckoning long overdue. Finlay stood in the study, dressed in a crisp white shirt and wool vest, staring at the paused security footage on the monitor. Lindsay entered quietly, Beckham still asleep in the nursery. She didn't need to ask what he was watching. "Who is he?" she said softly. Finlay exhaled. "Jared Collins, my father's former driver." Lindsay's eyes narrowed. Finlay nodded. "He was let go after my mother found him drunk in the garage, yelling at one of the maids." That was the official story. "But I remember he used to say things, ugly things about my mother, about Lydia." Lindsay stepped beside him. "Why now? Because he's bitter. Because people like him live off the hope that time won't change, that power will protect their hate." Finlay's voice was sharp, but not loud, controlled, focused, and when it didn't, they lash out. He turned to her, "But not this time. This time we face it head-on." By noon, Finlay had called Wesley Jensen. The estate attorney arrived within the hour, his demeanor urgent but calm. Finlay handed him a printed report, a list of all anonymous calls made to local agencies in the past 30 days, cross-referenced with GPS logs and background checks. Wesley scanned the sheet and grimaced. "Jared Collins, I should have guessed." "We'll file charges," Finlay said. "Defamation, harassment, endangerment." Wesley nodded. "Well, I need Lindsay to make a statement." Lindsay, standing by the fireplace, folded her arms. "I will." But her voice trembled just slightly. Finlay noticed. He crossed to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be strong alone." She looked up at him, eyes glistening. "I'm not scared. I'm scared he'll use Beckham, that somehow he'll drag him into all this." Finley's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure he can't." That evening, Lindsay sat alone in the sunroom, a legal pad in her lap, trying to write her statement, but words failed her. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because what she felt didn't fit neatly into paragraphs. She remembered being 16 and walking home from school while a white woman locked her car door at the sight of her. She remembered being 22 and overlooked for a promotion by a man who couldn't pronounce her name. And she remembered standing over Beckham's crib the night he first called her mama, wondering if she had the right to believe she could ever truly belong. Finley entered quietly and sat beside her. "I can't make this part easy," he said gently, "but I can stand beside you through it." She looked at him. Really looked. "Why me?" she asked, not with doubt, but with the vulnerability of someone who had spent her life being told she was less than. Finley didn't hesitate. "Because you're the one who stayed. The one who saw him not as a legacy or a name or a responsibility, but as a little boy who needed to be loved. And because you did that for him, I finally remembered how to love too." Lindsay looked down at her page, and this time she began to write. 3 days later, a formal hearing was held private behind closed doors. No press allowed. Finley had pulled every string to ensure discretion. Lindsay sat beside Wesley in the high ceiling room. Beckham stayed home with a trusted nanny. Finley sat directly behind Lindsay, hands folded, watching Jared Collins from across the aisle. The old man looked smaller than Finley remembered, bitter, pale, his suit too loose. He spoke with arrogance, feigning concern about Beckham's welfare. He referenced suspicious behavior, questionable backgrounds, and moral concerns. He referred to Lindsay not by name, but as the help. That's when Finley stood. "Mr. Collins," the judge warned, "you're not allowed to direct remarks." But Finley's voice cut through the room. "You don't care about Beckham. You never did. You served this family for decades and hated every second of it because it gave power to people you thought were beneath you." Jared turned red. "You've been fooled, son. That woman, she's playing you." "No," Finley said, voice steady. "She's healing me." Silence fell over the room. Then Lindsay stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shake. "My name is Lindsay Foster. I've cared for Beckham since he was barely a year old. I've held him through fevers, nightmares, first words, and heartbreaks. And when others abandoned him, when the world tried to reduce him to a bloodline, I reminded him that love isn't DNA, it's presence." She turned to the judge. "I'm not asking for permission to be his family. I am his family, and no lie from the past can change that." The ruling came swiftly. There was no evidence of wrongdoing, no merit to the claims. Jared Collins was fined for filing a malicious report and banned from all contact with the Walters estate. When Lindsay and Finley stepped outside, the hunter sun broke through the clouds just a little, as if the sky was remembering how to be kind again. That night, Lindsay sat at the edge of Beckham's bed. He was asleep, one hand wrapped around a tiny book she'd read him every night since he was 2. Finley entered the room and stood in the doorway. She turned to him, her face tired but radiant. "Is it over?" she asked. He nodded. "For now, then let it be quiet," she whispered. Finley crossed the room and knelt beside her. "You're my family, Lindsay. That's never changing." She reached for his hand, and this time, when he kissed her, it wasn't a question. It was a promise. Spring arrived quietly on the heels of a brutal hunter, bringing with it the scent of renewal. The magnolia trees on the Walters estate bloomed in soft pinks and whites, and the lawn, once buried beneath layers of snow and turmoil, turned a deep, forgiving green. On the morning of Beckham's official adoption ceremony, the house buzzed, not with stress or fear, but with joy. I really lived in earned joy. Finley stood in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting the knot of his tie for the 5th time. Lindsay peeked in from the doorway, holding Beckham's little suit jacket. "You're going to wear a hole in that tie if you keep fidgeting," she teased gently. Finley looked over his shoulder. "You'd think I was the one being adopted." Lindsay smiled. "In a way we all are." He took the jacket from her hands and helped her dress Beckham, who stood between them like a tiny, patient prince, humming to himself. "Do you know what today is, buddy?" Finley asked. Beckham nodded. "Our family day." Lindsay felt her throat tighten. The courthouse was modest. just a small white building nestled in the heart of town. No press, no drama, just a courtroom, a judge, and a small group of people who mattered. Wesley Shaw was there, standing tall with a folder in hand. Luke Porter sat in the second row, hands clasped tightly, eyes bright. Even Mrs. Shannon, the old librarian who had once read to Beckham on Tuesday afternoons, showed up with a tissue in one hand and a bag of cookies in the other. As they entered the room, the judge, an older black woman with silver hair and eyes like warm stone, looked up and smiled. "Mr. Walters. Miss Foster Beckham." She nodded once. "Let's make this official." The process was short. Lindsay stood first, her hand trembling as she was sworn in. The judge asked, "Do you accept full parental responsibility for Beckham Walters, with all the rights, obligations, and lifelong commitments it entails?" Lindsay looked down at the little boy in her arms. "With all that I am." Then Finley took the stand. He didn't shake. "Do you accept full parental responsibility for Beckham Walters formally and legally?" Finley spoke without hesitation. "I already have." The courtroom chuckled softly. The judge smiled again. "I've reviewed the documents," she said. "And I've read the letters. I see no contest, only love. And in this court, we recognize that love, when steadfast, is stronger than blood, longer than loss, and louder than fear." She picked up her pen. "In the eyes of the state and of this court, Beckham Walters is hereby and forevermore the legal child of Lindsay Foster and Finley Walters." The gavel struck. Applause broke out. Lindsay, unable to hold back the tears, bent down to kiss Beckham's forehead. Finley placed a gentle hand on her back, pulling both of them into his chest. And for a moment, the three of them simply stood there. No speeches, no noise, just breath, just belonging. Back at the house, the celebration was intimate. Beckham ran barefoot on the lawn, chasing bubbles. Lindsay blew from the porch. Luke sat with Mrs. Shannon under the oak tree, sipping lemonade and watching the boy he had helped bring into the world find joy in the life others had built for him. Finley stood at the grill, flipping burgers like any suburban dad, apron and all. He caught Lindsay's eye from across the yard. She walked over slowly, smiling softly and wide. He handed her a plate. "Didn't know I could cook, did you? I figured if you could learn how to love again, anything's possible." He chuckled, eyes twinkling. "You always did know how to humble a man. I will try." They sat on the edge of the porch steps, watching Beckham roll in the grass. "He's never going to remember the courthouse," Lindsay said, "but he'll remember this. The laughter, the light. He'll remember you," Finley said, "the way you looked at him like he was already home." Then she leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was scared I'd lose him," she whispered. "Scared I wasn't enough. You were the only one who was enough." They sat in silence for a while, soaking in the day, the warmth, the beginning of a new kind of forever. That evening, after the guests had gone and Beckham was asleep beneath a new quilt stitched with his name, Finley and Lindsay stood in the nursery doorway, just watching him. "He's peaceful," Finley said softly. "He's loved," Lindsay replied. They turned to leave, but just before she stepped out, Lindsay stopped. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." Finley waited. She looked at him, eyes full and unafraid. "I'm pregnant." Time stopped. Then Finley exhaled one soft, astonished breath. "Lindsay, I wasn't sure when to tell you. I didn't want anything to distract me from today." He stepped forward, taking her hands in his. "You just made today mean even more." They didn't cry. Not this time. This time, they simply held each other. Two lives now tethered by something deeper than grief or circumstance. Hope. A home rebuilt from ashes, a family stitched from truth. A future bright and unshakable. Outside, the porch light flickered on, bathing the front steps in soft gold. The magnolia swayed gently in the wind, petals falling like snow, graceful, slow, and quiet. Inside, the Walters house no longer whispered of loss. It sang of love, of second chances, of a woman who was never just a maid, and a man who finally understood that the heart's truest home is the one we choose to build together. At its heart, this story teaches us that family is not defined by blood, but by love, loyalty, and the courage to stay. It reminds us that healing often begins where judgment ends, and that even in a world scarred by prejudice and pain, compassion can rebuild what was once broken. Through Lindsay's resilience and Finley's redemption, we learned that the truest bonds are forged not by circumstance, but by choice. And in choosing each other, despite fear, despite the past, they created something unshakable, a home where love always has the final. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done?